Hi, and welcome to this episode of John's Motorcycle Rescue and Review. Today we are looking at Honda's 1974 through 1976 CB360 and CB360T. In this video we'll talk about the history of the CB360. We'll also take a look at the specs on the bike and the performance of the bike. And the Honda CB360 really holds a special place in my heart. It was the first street motorcycle that I ever rode. So I'll give my riding impressions of that as well. Looking at the history of the Honda CB360, Honda had produced the CB350 Twin for quite a few years, and it was a simple twin-cylinder overhead cam design. Honda was really looking to improve the bike, and as such, the CB360 really featured a host of internal engine changes. The head design on the CB360 was changed to be like that of the CB550 4-cylinder. It also had an upgraded oil pump and an upgraded timing chain adjuster and a new 6-speed gearbox compared to the CB350's 5-speed gearbox. Like the Honda CB350, the Honda CB360 was designed as a basic transportation bike. It was really a no-frills mid-size bike, and it was designed for commuting and general transportation as opposed to touring or performance. Looking at the specs of the bike, there is the 1974 Honda CB360, which had a drum brake as standard. It also had an optional front disc brake, and that became a standard feature on the CB360T. The front suspension on the Honda CB360 was a non-adjustable telescopic front fork. It featured very basic conventional rear shocks. It also had a tubular steel frame and a drum rear brake. The wet weight on the CB360 was 386 pounds. The engine was a 356cc 2-valve per cylinder single overhead cam twin-cylinder motor. It produced 34 horsepower at just over 9,000 RPM. It had a 9.3 to 1 compression ratio, and the engine was fed by two Kian CV-type carbs. It had a 6-speed transmission and chain final drive. The CB360 featured a 31-inch seat height. It had a 2.9-gallon fuel tank, and it averaged 51 miles per gallon in testing. Performance-wise, in Cycle World testing in March of 1974, the CB360 clocked off a 100-mile-an-hour top speed. It could hit 0 to 60 in 7 seconds flat. It had a 15.9-second quarter-mile time at a terminal speed of 83.48 miles per hour. So what was Honda's CB360 like to ride? I'll never forget my first ride on the CB360. When I was 17 years old, my dad purchased a CB360 locally, and he had taken it to the shop to get it inspected. The bike shop called when the bike was ready to be picked up, and my dad and I drove over in the car, and he got on the bike. About halfway home, he pulled into a church parking lot and took off his helmet and walked back to the car. And I thought something was wrong. And he handed me the helmet, and he said, "I'll see you at home." I got out of the car and put the helmet on, and he left in the car. Though I had never ridden a motorcycle on the street before, I had driven a stick-shift car, so I knew the functionality of the clutch and the brakes and the gas. But that's certainly not the way I would recommend teaching your kid how to drive a motorcycle. So I left the church parking lot, and I will never forget that ride. It was a beautiful day in May, and I absolutely loved the freedom of being on the motorcycle. Because it was a smaller bike, it felt very adventurous to be out on the road with it. And fortunately, I made it home safely, and I've been hooked on motorcycling ever since. Since it was my first motorcycle, I was really struck by the fact that I could rev it all the way up to 9,000 RPM. I was used to cars of the time redlining at right around 5,000 RPM, and I just thought the high revs were a revelation. It was the late 80s when we had the CB360, and although it wasn't a performance motorcycle, because it was a motorcycle, it could keep up with a lot of the performance cars of the time, and a 15-second quarter-mile time was actually a pretty quick car back in those days. The instrumentation on the CB360 was very basic. It had a large speedometer and a large tachometer. There was no fuel gauge. This came into play the one time that I was riding the bike. While I was out in the middle of nowhere, kind of exploring on the bike, the engine started to sputter, and I reached down to turn the fuel petcock to the reserve position, only to realize that I had forgotten to turn it back to the on position the last time I had filled up with gas. So I was well and truly out of gas, and I had to pay a gentleman $20 to throw it in the back of his pickup truck and drive me the 20 minutes back to my house. Needless to say, I learned that lesson well, and I've not run out of gas since on a motorcycle. Because of the very basic nature of the Honda CB360, it had a pretty hard seat on it. It really wasn't a touring bike. It was much more suited to back roads and in-town driving. Engine vibration was always present. The vibration wasn't large amplitude vibration, so it wasn't as vibey as my later KZ750 Twin from Kawasaki. The 6-speed transmission always shifted very nicely for me, and that's a good thing since as a small displacement bike, you had to keep the bike revving to stay in the power. The handling on the CB360 was also very basic. It wasn't great in the corners, and it really just highlighted the pedestrian nature of the bike. In retrospect, I think the CB360 was just a good basic bike. It was a good bike for me to learn on. It certainly didn't have an overabundance of power. And that's good because the brakes didn't work all that great either. One aspect of the CB360 that I really liked was the styling on the bike. I thought it was very cleanly styled. I liked the upswept mufflers on it. These bikes can still be had very inexpensively. They were never really an enthusiast bike. They were always just basic transportation. And as such, I think they were a successful design. Well, I'd love to know what you guys think. If any of you have owned or ridden a Honda CB360, please feel free to share in the comment section below. As always, I hope you found this video entertaining and informative, and until next time, enjoy the ride.